Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining our ACE Spotlight session today. My name is Sajeda, and I'm the Machine Learning and Physics stream owner here at ACE. I am very excited to be hosting Dr. Stephen Brunton today, who will be speaking to us about some of his work and the work of others in the field of machine learning for fluid dynamics. Dr. Steve Brunton is currently a professor and researcher at the University of Washington. He received his PhD in mechanical and aerospace engineering from Princeton University and his Bachelor's of Science in Mathematics with a minor in Control and Dynamical Systems from California Institute of Technology. He has completed really incredible work in the field of machine learning for dynamical systems, and his research focuses on combining techniques in dimensionality reduction, sparse sensing, and machine learning for the data-driven discovery and control of complex dynamical systems. Some specific applications of his work in fluid dynamics include closed-loop turbulence control for mixing enhancement and renewable energy. And some more general applications include neuroscience, medical data analysis, and optical systems. And apart from this, Dr. Brunton also received the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, which is a very high honor from the United States government to outstanding scientists and engineers who are beginning their independent research careers and who show exceptional promise for leadership in science and technology. Apart from all of this, you can also find Stephen Brunton on YouTube if you haven't already. He has a very popular channel with over 4 million views where he simplifies these really complex ideas in mathematics and engineering through really beautiful explanations and visuals, and it's very informative and very pleasant to watch. So it's really an honor to be hosting Dr. Brunton this afternoon. And without further ado, I will let him start his presentation. And after he presents, there will be an open discussion. So if you have any questions that happen throughout the presentation, you can type them on the YouTube live chat and I can relay them during the discussion portion. So without further ado, please welcome Steve Brunton.
Well, thank you so much for the kind introduction and also invitation. So it's really a pleasure to be here today and to speak with you all and tell you some of the exciting things happening in the kind of broader field of machine learning for fluid dynamics. And this is a field that I am very passionate about. I've always loved fluids. They are everywhere. So we literally live and work and breathe inside of a fluid. So do all of our machines. And so, you know, the ability to understand and control fluid dynamics better has just profound technological and societal impacts. You know, I started giving this version of the talk about maybe a year and a half ago when my colleague Bernd Nowak and Petros Koumoutsakis and I wrote a review paper on this topic. And the title slide I used to give was a fixed image of Van Gogh's Starry Night. And within the last few months, I found this beautiful, moving kind of picture designed by Petros Vrelis that shows kind of the Starry Night brought to life. And this really embodies a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, which is the field of fluid dynamics can really leverage decades of incredible work, billions of dollars of infrastructure and investment that has gone into imaging sciences and machine learning for industry. So think Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, all of that knowledge that we've learned for audio signals and images, we're going to start to carry over into fluid dynamics. So before I jump in, I want to acknowledge some of my great colleagues, co-authors, postdocs, and students who have been working on these topics in particular. And this is just kind of a small slice of the larger lab and group of collaborators that are working on these topics. So I'm going to highlight a few of these today, but this is just kind of a zoom in of a much larger effort, combining machine learning for dynamical systems. And so today I'm going to focus particularly on fluid dynamics, but I want you to be thinking kind of most of the methods I'm talking about are general to any high dimensional nonlinear complex system. So I'll get back to that a little bit more later. Okay, so I usually kind of talk to academic crowds, but sometimes I talk to senior vice presidents at companies or CEOs, and I am talking to them about what the potential of machine learning is for their business. And oftentimes you get this feeling that they see machine learning as kind of a magic wand. So you have a problem that you want to solve, some engineering challenge, and you're going to point machine learning at it, and poof, you're going to solve that problem. And that's just not how it works. So I want to kind of demystify how I see machine learning interfacing with hard engineering and science, especially for dynamical systems. And in particular, for at least fluid dynamics, the way I see it is that most of our tasks in fluid dynamics, in blue, are can be posed as very challenging optimization problems in pink. So for example, in fluid dynamics, we might want to model the fluid. We might want to take our high dimensional representation of the fluid. So we take our governing Navier-Stokes equations, I discretize them so that I can simulate them on a computer, and I get a system that has millions or billions of degrees of freedom. So very expensive to solve for optimization, design, and control. But maybe I want to find a reduced order model, a model with 4 or 5 terms that does as good of a job as possible capturing the features I care about. So that can be posed as an optimization problem. Maybe I want to control the system. I want to actually manipulate the flow over a wing to enhance the lift or reduce the drag. And most control problems are posed as optimization problems historically. And there's many other tasks like where to place sensors and things like that. And so in pink here, we see that these optimization problems are quite challenging because the original system is high dimensional. Remember I said there were millions, if not billions of degrees of freedom. It's nonlinear because the Navier-Stokes equations, the fluid flow equations, are nonlinear. And that leads to a highly non-convex optimization landscape. So there's lots and lots of local minima in a very high dimensional optimization landscape, which is super challenging. That has been challenging for decades. But fortunately, machine learning, if I oversimplify, machine learning is a growing set of techniques to build models from data via optimization. And the machine learning optimizations are getting really good at solving these types of highly non-convex, high-dimensional optimization problems. So if you think of deep neural networks, that's exactly how the training works. There's a super non-convex landscape, very high-dimensional, but with enough data and enough horsepower, you can find really good solutions with machine learning. And so these kind of classic engineering tasks and these hard optimization problems, they go together very well with machine learning, this kind of emerging set of enhanced optimization with data, okay? And again, I love fluid dynamics, but you might not. If you have any system that is high dimensional, nonlinear, multi-scale in space and time, all of this applies. Okay, so think about a disease ripping across a continent, or all of the neurons in your brain working together to understand this sentence or to remember what you were thinking about 5 minutes ago. Okay, those are similarly high-dimensional, nonlinear dynamical systems that you can use machine learning for. Okay, good. So I'm going to kind of just jump right in, and again, a lot of this covers aspects that we discussed in this review paper with Bernd and Petros that came out last year. So a big theme in both fluid dynamics and in imaging sciences is that patterns exist in the data. So fluid dynamics is based on this idea that there are these dominant patterns that exist. Even though I need millions of degrees of freedom to simulate a fluid, there might be 3 or 4 or 5 key coherent structures in that flow that matter for my daily life, for control and optimization and design. This is a flow over Rishiri Island in Japan. So these are actual clouds over the island at geological scales, Earth scales. And below, we see this very, very simple simulation at low Reynolds number. This is a toy simulation, but they have a lot of the same patterns that exist. And so exploiting patterns and coherence in the data is both the cornerstone of classic fluid dynamics and of machine learning. And if I had more time, I would make an argument that a lot of modern machine learning actually came out of computational fluid mechanics in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And now it's coming full circle, and we're starting to use these new powerful techniques that are coming out of machine learning. Okay, good. So those patterns that exist in the data allow us to do pretty amazing things that seem sometimes like magic, but we can, again, demystify these and write them as mathematical optimization problems. So this is work by Isabel Scherl, who's an excellent PhD student at University of Washington, working with me and Brian Pelagi. And what she did was she took this robust principal components algorithm that was developed in the statistics literature by Candes et al. And she has adapted this to fluid dynamics data for incredible denoising. So oftentimes when we collect measurements from experiments in fluids, we have a movie like we see in the left here. So you can tell that there's some coherent patterns in the background, but there's salt and pepper noise all over the image, kind of like TV static, okay? And what Isabel is able to do through optimization is decompose this movie into a sum of two movies, or matrices, if you will, where the first one is the low dimensional coherent structures in the data, and the second matrix is all of the sparse outliers, the salt and pepper noise. Now, again, this seems like this is too good to be true, because there are infinitely many ways you can split that data matrix X into the sum of two data matrices L plus S. There's infinitely many of these decompositions. So how do we select the right one that gives us this beautiful, clean, low-rank movie L and moves all of the outliers and noise to a contaminated matrix S? And it turns out that this can be written as, again, an optimization problem. So we want to minimize the rank of the L matrix, so it's low rank. And we want to minimize the zero norm of the S matrix so that when they add up, they equal my original data matrix X. Now, this is a non-convex optimization, but you can relax this to something that you can solve in a scalable fashion with Moore's law. And this optimization allows you to separate this movie. So a couple of takeaways I want to make right now. The first one is, if you can take your flow field and you can treat it as a sequence of images, like a movie, or an audio sequence, then you immediately can inherit years and years of powerful techniques developed in machine learning. Okay, and that's exactly what Isabel did here. So she was able to look at this as a movie and use relatively standard optimization techniques to decontaminate this movie. Okay, good. And the other one is that choosing the optimization problem is extremely important to encode your physical prior about what the real world should look like. So this optimization problem, although it looks compact, it has a lot of baked in prior expert knowledge about what the structure of these two matrices should be based on experience. Good. Okay. So another huge area of development in image science is super resolution. And this is the idea of going from a low resolution image, like on the left, to a very high resolution inferred image on the right. Again, this seems too good to be true, but we know the statistical structure of images. They have all kinds of structure that allow us to infer what would be in the high resolution image just from the low resolution. So for example, if I take my glasses off and I squint a little at the left image, I can almost pretend that I'm seeing something that's much higher resolution because my brain is filling in those patterns. And we can train machines to do this as well. So this is hugely important for fluid mechanics, where it is, again, too expensive often to simulate the full resolution fluid flow, for example, over a Boeing jet or a submarine. And so instead, we might want to simulate a low resolution version, but fill in the details at intermediate steps. And so this is a project by Ben Erickson, who at the time was a postdoc working with us, with Nathan Kutz and myself. And he essentially developed a shallow decoder network to build this super resolution inference. And a couple of interesting features here. He did not use a deep neural network. One of his points was that he wanted to show what you can do with shallow learning. And so shallow learning is actually really quite good here. And the other kind of interesting point here, so we're using the Johns Hopkins turbulence data on the top. And so the left, you see this high resolution image that we use to train. And what we do is we give the algorithm pairs of high resolution and low resolution data, and we train this decoder to infer the high resolution from the low resolution. And you can see on the far right in panel C, the decoder reconstruction from the low resolution image in B is actually almost perfect. It's an excellent, excellent reconstruction. But then we started digging a little deeper, and we realized that what we were essentially doing was an interpolation task. So this is a fluid flow that's evolving in time. It's a movie again. And in the lower left here, you see kind of a representation of this movie in time. So each column is an image, and each column as it goes to the right is advancing in time. And so what we do, our training data are all of those dark gray columns, and our test data are those bright blue columns. So essentially, all of our test data is sandwiched between training data. And so we can interpolate between things we've already seen to infer those bright blue flow fields when we're testing. And it does an amazing job. Deep learning or shallow learning, neural networks in general, are excellent at interpolation tasks, at mixing things you've seen before and inferring something. But in fluid dynamics and climate science, for example, if I want to predict the future of the climate, or I want to predict what my drag is going to look like after my training data, it looks a lot more like this lower right picture, where I have maybe 80% of my training data is in the past, and then my testing starts to predict the future in blue. And so this is no longer an interpolation task, it's an extrapolation task. And it turns out that this is really, really hard for most neural network architectures, is extrapolation. But that's actually much more what we actually want in fluid mechanics, is to kind of train on historical data and then start to predict the future, okay? And fluid flows are non-stationary. We don't believe that the climate is going to be the same in the next 100 years that it was in the past 100 years. And so these are huge challenges for using these for fluids. So in my estimation, this is my opinion, what we need is to build in additional structure that makes our learning machines more physical by construction. So the only kind of tools we have as engineers and scientists that actually can be used for extrapolation are physics models. F equals ma, E equals mc squared. Those are techniques that extrapolate. And so we need to build that physics into our learning machines. Okay, good. And so that segues really nicely into the last part of my presentation. So this is, maybe I'll take 10 minutes here to talk about how we're using machine learning for reduced order modeling in fluids. How do we get dynamical systems models that capture the key coherent structures in the fluids? Okay. And I want to just make a little bit of a philosophical point here, that we don't just want black box neural network models. We want machine learning models that can be interpreted by humans and generalized past the training data that we've seen. And again, I always think of Newton's F equals ma as the ultimate interpretable generalizable model. We can discuss what it means as humans. It has 3 terms, so we can talk about what F, M, and A mean. And it generalizes in the sense that it can be learned by Newton on Earth with a falling apple, and it's still true when we land humans on the moon. Okay, so that's ultimate generalizability right there. You could train neural networks all day long on falling apple movies, and they would probably faithfully reproduce movies of falling apples, but they would never be useful for landing humans on the moon. And this is not just true of Newton. This has been true for thousands of years of mathematical science and engineering. This principle of parsimony, that things should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. And so mathematically, in this modern era of data-driven learning and machine learning, the way we impose these ideas is by having low-dimensional models that have only a few variables and sparse models that have only a few terms in the dynamics. So again, we can communicate and discuss these models. And that generally makes them interpretable, generalizable, and robust. Good. So in the modern era, what this looks like, so many of you have seen this beautiful movie of chaotic thermal convection. So this is kind of a simulation of how the Earth's atmosphere, might kind of create these convection cells. And the Lorenz 1963 model, this famous butterfly attractor model on the right, is kind of what we mean, the kind of model we want. It's low dimensional, so it is used to describe this chaotic thermal convection. What they did was they took something like this, a simulation, and they extracted 3 dominant spatial modes that they thought were important. That represents X, Y, and Z. And the dynamics on the right-hand side only have a few terms. Out of all of the possible dynamical systems, the differential equations that could have been written, this one is actually quite simple. The first equation has 2 terms, the second equation has 3 terms, and the third equation has 2 terms. So it's low dimensional and sparse, and it captures this dominant chaotic convection that's observed here. Now, I've included Linda Fetter and Margaret Hamilton on this author list because they were actually graduate students at MIT working with Lorenz, and they set up all of his supercomputer simulations to generate the data. So by modern standards, they probably would have been co-authors on this paper, and I think it's important not to forget them in history. Okay, good. So I'm going to try to build models that are like the Lorenz 1963 model, but purely from data using machine learning techniques. And so what we do, this sparse identification of nonlinear dynamics algorithm I'm going to walk you through, we take that dynamical system and we assume that we're measuring x, y, and z, so we know the right coordinate system. So each column of blue, red, and green are measurements of x, y, and z in time, and we assume we can measure their derivatives too. Now, the simplest thing you might try to do is build a linear model that fits x dot, y dot, and z dot to x, y, and z. This is what the dynamic mode decomposition would do. But that's really not good enough to describe these rich chaotic dynamics observed on the left. So instead, what we do is we augment the right-hand side library of possible terms in x dot, y dot, and z dot, the time derivatives of x, y, and z, to include higher order terms, polynomials, x squared, y squared, xy, and so on, up to, in this case, z to the fifth. And now the task is to find the fewest columns of theta, the fewest terms in the right-hand side that add up to equal the x dot data, the y dot data, and the z dot data. And it turns out that nowadays, this is kind of a commodity optimization. Sparse regression problems, there's dozens of ways of solving these efficiently on modern computational hardware. And so you're able to find the fewest columns that equal x dot, y dot, and z dot efficiently. And when you do so, it turns out that the model that you uncover actually highlights exactly the terms in the original Lorenz equation that generated the data. Now, I didn't show this system the equations at all. All I did was use the measurement data from the system, and we uncovered the nonlinear dynamical system that is most, the best fit with that data while being as sparse as possible. Okay? And so we've uncovered that Lorenz 1963 model. Now, I'll point out, if you're interested in trying this on your data to uncover a nonlinear dynamical system, we just put out a package called PyCindy that you can download and try this on your own. So I highly encourage that. You can also use this to discover partial differential equations. So if I have my fluid flow example here, which is a spatial temporal field, so it's got space and time, and let's say I measure all of the variables in space and time, I can build a library of partial derivatives of vorticity with respect to x or y. And I can build all of these nonlinear combinations and do the same sparse regression procedure. And it turns out that in that case, I uncover the original Navier-Stokes dynamical system, which is pretty cool. So you find kind of the original Navier-Stokes partial differential equation purely from your measurement data. Now, because space-time data like this is so rich, there's so high dimensional, there's so much of it, it turns out you can dramatically subsample your data, and with even 1% of the original data smartly sampled, you can still identify these ordinary or partial differential equations. Okay, so one other thing I'll talk about is that you can also use deep learning to discover good coordinate systems where these models exist. So this is great work by Kathleen Champion when she was a PhD student with Nathan Kutz and myself. And the idea here is that oftentimes I don't know what the right coordinate systems are where my system is simple and low dimensional and sparse. And so what Kathleen did was she combined this Cindy idea of getting sparse nonlinear models with a deep neural network autoencoder to find good low dimensional coordinate system where the data is accurately represented with a few variables. And I'll point out that in the history of mathematical science and mathematical physics, this idea of finding good coordinate transformations is central. So Newton didn't discover F equals ma until Copernicus put the sun at the center of our solar system. And the Fourier transform was specifically developed to sparsify or diagonalize the heat equation. So coordinate transformations and sparse representations go hand in hand. And that's exactly what Kathleen was developing here. So it's an autoencoder that takes your data tries to find a low-dimensional latent space in Z where the dynamics in Z are sparse. And in doing so, she was able to uncover lots of good coordinate systems and sparse dynamical systems kind of simultaneously. So that's pretty exciting for us. Now, it turns out you can put even stronger constraints on the system. And in the middle layer, instead of having a SINDI model, a sparse nonlinear model, you can enforce that the dynamics are actually linear. Now, this is a stronger constraint, so it puts more, it's harder for the encoder and the decoder to satisfy this linearity in the middle. But if you can achieve this, it's related to this Koopman operator theory, which shows that you can take nonlinear dynamical systems, and through an appropriate coordinate transformation, you can linearize them. And that's huge because that means we can apply simple techniques from linear estimation, prediction, and control theory, which are one-line commands in MATLAB or Python, to very, very strongly nonlinear systems if we find these coordinate transforms. Okay, so I think I only have a little bit more time, so I'll just point out that we applied this to very complicated systems in fluid dynamics. So for example, if I take my flow past a cylinder and I measure it in these 3 coordinates on the left, my friend and colleague Bernd Nowak in 2003 showed that this system can be represented by this nonlinear differential equation in the blue box, which has this slow manifold behavior and quadratic nonlinearities. And when we apply the same data to our SINDI algorithm, when we present it to SINDI, SINDI discovers that same dynamical system that has this slow manifold attractor that you can see on the left, and most of the same dynamics. My friend JC Loiseau from Paris Tech, very quickly after we wrote this original paper, introduced 2 key innovations that made a huge difference in improving this. So the first innovation that he made is that when we're doing this sparse regression in SINDI, you can add equality constraints to every stage of that regression. And because we know so much about fluids, we can write down equality constraints that enforce energy conservation by construction. So we can essentially bake in known physics that makes it so our models are conservative by construction. And the other innovation he added was that you can have these higher order nonlinear terms. So you can add cubic, quintic, septic, 3rd, 5th, 7th order terms. And you get much, much better model performance because you're approximating modes that you threw away, low energy modes. You're approximating how they affect the dominant coherent structures and patterns that we are modeling in the X, Y, and Z variables. And so in doing so, we're able to massively improve these models over the industry standard models that I'm showing here. So for these 2 flows of cavity flow and cylinder flow, on the right column here, you see the industry best models in yellow and blue. They're trying to predict these white curves, which are essentially proxies for the drag of these 2 fluid flows. And you can see that they are qualitatively getting the right features. They have a rise and a steady state, but they're quantitatively pretty inaccurate. They rise too fast, they overshoot, and they don't have the right steady state error. But if we apply the same training data to the SINDI model with constraints and with cubic nonlinearities, we almost perfectly quantitatively match this drag coefficient. So this is pretty impressive that we're able to get this very, very good quantitative agreement with these fluid flows. And because they're sparse models, you can actually write down the differential equation and manipulate it by hand, which is exactly what JC did. And he was able to write down the flow past a cylinder model that was discovered by SINDI as this nonlinear spring mass damper system. So this is essentially a van der Pol oscillator. This is both the simplest and the most accurate reduced order model for a flow past a cylinder that has been written down to date. And I think that's amazing. It's both interpretable, generalizable, it's highly accurate, and it's highly compact. Okay, so last thing I'll show is that you can also apply this to much more complicated systems. I have some backup slides if you're interested where I can show you lots of cool fluid flows we've applied this to. So in this fluidic pinball where you have 3 cylinders and you get this much more broadband behavior, 2 things. One is sometimes in flows, you can't measure the whole flow field. So if I'm flying, in a Boeing 787, I can't measure the whole flow field. I might be able to measure what's happening on my wings or the lift and the drag, things like that. And so we can build models just on these intrinsic variables of lift and drag on those 3 cylinders. And in the lower row, you actually see that our low order model in blue is almost perfectly matching the full numerical simulations. And this model was built entirely on those lift and drag coefficients. So that's pretty exciting that we can kind of achieve that level of fidelity just from these SIMD models. Okay, so I probably don't have time to go through all of my favorite fluid flow examples, so maybe I will end here and we can have a discussion and talk about stuff. And if you have any questions, that get into some of these other applications, I can kind of show you bits and pieces as we go. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the really, really great presentation. I'm going to begin by reading out some questions in the chat. So we have a question here that asks, what's the input-output of these deep autoencoders in the context of fluid dynamics?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what are the inputs and outputs of these deep autoencoders in the context of fluid dynamics? So maybe I'll just go to my slide here. Okay, so here's my deep autoencoder. Now it turns out what I mean by deep autoencoder is that it has lots of layers. That's what I mean by deep. And it's an autoencoder because the inputs and the outputs should be the same variable x. So x hat on the right is an approximation of x on the left. So essentially what an autoencoder does, this is a compression task. We are trying to take a high dimensional signal x, we're trying to compress it down to the smallest z possible so that just with the information from z, I can decompress it back to an estimate of the high dimensional signal x that's as faithful as possible. Again, that's an optimization problem. So in the case of fluid dynamics, maybe the input x would be the whole high dimensional image, a megapixel image of my fluid flow, high fidelity picture of my flow. And z is some latent variable that is the most compression I can get out of that high dimensional signal and still reconstruct it on x hat. So for me, I usually think of the autoencoder input and output as being the full fluid flow field in space at a particular instance in time. Yeah, good question. Oh, sorry, one other point. If it was a shallow autoencoder, if I got rid of all of those middle layers except for z, so it just went from x to z to x hat, and if my activation functions, if my nodes were just linear functions, so these were essentially matrices going from x to z and z to x hat, this would actually recover the classical singular value decomposition or principal components analysis, which we have been using for decades in image science and in fluid mechanics to extract low dimensional representations. So, principal components analysis or singular value decomposition is just the standard linear embedding technique for high dimensional data. And that is a special case of this deep autoencoder where there is just x to z to x hat and all of the layers are linear. So this essentially generalizes principal components analysis, or SVD, to a nonlinear embedding where you can get even better compression.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to add to that. When you say that your input is snapshots, do you mean that they're literally images and they're matrices of pixel values? Or are they treated as a sort of mesh with the actual value of the flow variable at that point in time and space?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think this is still kind of an open question. There's lots of groups working on this that are trying different things. And so there's different ways of shaping that input vector X. I'll point out probably the oldest paper I'm aware of that uses deep autoencoders in fluids is by Milano and Koumoutsakis in 2002, which is way ahead of its time, almost 20 years ahead of the curve there. But so there's a lot of ways of doing this. One way you could do it is I could take that full megapixel image and I could, or whatever my image size is, and I could reshape it into an extremely tall, skinny vector. So that's like the simplest thing you would do with SVD or principal components. You just take your image, reshape it into a tall vector, and that would be X. Now there's usually issues with doing that, like the memory requirements would be too large if you did that. So a lot of times what you would do is you'd have a convolutional layer on this autoencoder to immediately crunch it down to a much, much smaller dimension. So convolutional autoencoders are really important here. You also could have the input be a full two-dimensional image and have a two-dimensional convolutional layer that's working on it. That would be kind of a standard thing that people do nowadays. Other things you could do, you could take X and you could run a classic SVD or principal component to go from maybe 1,000,000 variables down to 1,000. And then you could do the autoencoder on the principal component coefficients, those 1,000 variables of the PCA coefficients. So lots and lots of choices here. And we're not sure what the best approach is. People are still kind of working this out for fluids. I think convolutional autoencoders have the best chance of really getting the best compression and being the most generalizable, because we know that fluid flows have this incredible self-similarity at different scales. So big scales often look like medium scales, often look like small scales. And we know that kind of convolutional autoencoders are good at capturing that kind of self-similarity.
Yeah, absolutely. We have another question. Can you please elaborate a bit on how Cindy achieves sparse dynamics? I get how you would go to low dimensional manifolds representing your data, but how do you ensure that the dynamics are actually sparse?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I completely glossed over that, so good catch. So let me just go to this part here. Okay, so let's walk through this step. So Cindy has a few key steps. The first one, and again, I glossed over how we do this. The first and most important step is, what are the variables I measure that I feed into the Cindy algorithm? What is X, Y, and Z? Okay, because if I have data, I get to choose, what coordinates I measure my system in sometimes. So let's assume I measured X, Y, and Z in a smart way, because Lorenz did and Bernd Nowak did, and they told me how to do it. And I built my nonlinear library theta that had all of these polynomial terms, and I'm just trying to find the fewest terms on the right-hand side that add up to equal X dot. How do we make it so that we get a sparse combination of columns of theta that equal X dot? There are dozens of ways of doing this. This is called sparse regression. And probably the most famous method is by Tib Shirani, called the lasso method, least absolute shrinkage operator and selection operator, the lasso, I think from 1996. What we do is something called sequentially thresholded least squares. So let me walk you through that. What we do is we do a least squares regression. We find the best coefficients of all of the columns of theta that add up to X dot. So it's just a least squares regression, pseudo inverse. That's a one-line command in Python and MATLAB. And so we get a little bit of coefficient adding up all of those columns of theta. In this case, I think there's 81 columns. So I get a vector with 81 coefficients, and they're all non-zero when I do least squares regression. But fortunately, a lot of them are small. And so I take all of the small coefficients that are below some threshold, and I manually zero them out. Maybe I get 10 coefficients remaining. So now I do a least squared regression onto those remaining 10 coefficients. And some of those become small. So I throw those away. I manually threshold those. Then I do a least squares regression onto the remaining coefficients, and I throw away the small ones. And eventually this converges, and what's left are these two terms, X and Y. Those are the dominant terms that remain after I sequentially threshold my least squares regression. So that is like the simplest algorithm in the world. I basically just was desperate. I couldn't get this thing to converge, and I coded it up in 10 lines of MATLAB, in 15 minutes in my office one day. And it worked better than anything else I tried. It worked better than lasso, many, many other sparse regression techniques. And then working with colleagues like Sasha Aravkin and others, we've essentially learned that that is a formal relaxation of the L0 minimum norm solution, which is non-convex. So it's one of the formal relaxations that is scalable and convex, is this sequentially thresholded least squares regression. And the really cool thing about it is that when you do the least squares regression, again, that's a pseudo inverse. You take the pseudo inverse of theta, you multiply it by x dot, and you get an approximation for xi on the right. When you do that pseudo inverse least squares regression, you can enforce those equality constraints that JC wrote down, JC Loiseau. And so this is really, really powerful in the sense that you can enforce known physics if you can write them as equality constraints on the coefficients in Xi when you do the sequentially thresholded least squares. All of this was just a happy accident. We just coded it up and it worked. And then we found out years later that this turns out to be a really good sparse optimization procedure. Yeah, great question. Thank you.
Thank you for the detailed answer. I just wanted to add to that because I was thinking about how you expanded Cindy to use the autoencoder to determine what variables of interest might best describe the dynamics.
Yeah.
I was wondering for the library of functions, what if you were dealing with something you didn't have any idea about and you didn't know what library of functions would best represent it, or to what dimension you would go up to, like cubic, and yeah, I was wondering if there's any idea of how Cindy would just discover those itself as well, or if that's too far-fetched.
That's a fantastic question. So, okay, good. So now we're really getting into the nuts and bolts. Okay, so I said that there were a few key ingredients of Cindy. The first one is, what do we measure? What's a good variable? So the autoencoder, its entire purpose is to answer that question. So how do I go from some X variable that I don't know what's the right thing to measure down to some Z that's a good coordinate system? Your question is, how do I know what the library theta should include? How do I know that polynomials are good instead of sines and cosines, or Bessel's functions, or Aries functions? How do I know that cubic is good enough and I don't need to go to quintic or septic or nonic or whatever? So that's a fantastic question. And we have a few decent answers to that. It's still an open question. But a kind of half answer is, usually when I am approaching a new physical system, I do know something about it. Right. So when I work in nonlinear optics with my colleague Nathan Kutz, high-powered lasers, we know that the governing equation for lasers is the nonlinear Schrodinger equation. And I know what types of terms are in the nonlinear Schrodinger equation. There's, U modulus U squareds and things like that. U times the modulus of U squareds, and U times the modulus of U to the fourth power, and things like that. So that can guide the types of terms that I would put into my theta matrix. If I'm dealing with fluid flows, fortunately, we actually know that those are polynomial nonlinearities. In fact, they're quadratic nonlinearities. And because of a separation of timescales in fluids, I can take quadratic nonlinearities and build up cubic and quintic and septic and nonic. So I know that polynomials are good for fluids. In other systems like metabolic networks, so Neil Mangan, who is a postdoc with Nathan and Josh Proctor, was working on metabolic regulatory networks in animals. And we know the form of the nonlinearity that those take. And so that guides a lot of how we build this library theta, is just like, what is the master set of kind of governing equations that we have seen in the past for these systems? That guides our choice of theta. Now, the second, that's kind of the first part of the answer. The second part of the answer is, polynomials almost always work well in a good coordinate system because of Taylor series approximations. Regardless of what my dynamics are, there's usually some kind of good Taylor series approximation that works at least in a decent region in the right coordinate system. So let's say I'm looking at a pendulum and I know my dynamics have sines and cosines in those, but let's say I was kind of ignorant of that and I didn't use sines and cosines. I could get a pretty decent approximation by Taylor series expanding my sine function into linear, cubic, and quintic terms. And I would actually get a really good approximation of those pendulum dynamics, at least for the domain that I was training on. But that's still kind of an open question. It's a really good question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That makes sense. I have a lot of questions in the chat, so I'm going to move forward. Can you recap on the definition of sparse dynamics? Is it simply dynamics covered by low order polynomials?
No, so the polynomials is not the key feature here. What I mean by sparsity, so okay, that's a great question. Sparsity mathematically means that my vector of coefficients, as many of them are 0 as possible. So in this plot here on the far right, you see this big matrix Xi, and Xi1 tells me what coefficients are active to describe Z1 dot. Xi2 tells me what coefficients are active to describe Z2 dot, and so on. And you'll notice that those vectors are sparse. Most of the entries of Xi are 0, and only a couple of terms are highlighted as being non-zero or active. And those correspond specifically to the terms that are in the differential equation that's identified. So here, sparse mathematically means we want the Xi vectors to have as many 0 entries as possible. Now, that turns out to be a non-convex optimization. As many zeros as possible is not a convex optimization problem. And so there's many, many ways of relaxing that optimization to something that can be solved. So one proxy is to make Xi have the smallest one norm as possible. And that's actually the Cindy regularization in the lower right. So that relaxes it to something that is solvable. But we want, and again, mathematically, if I go back to my Lorenz system, let's see it here. So my system being sparse on the upper right, having as many zeros as possible, is similar to the actual Lorenz system on the left, having as few terms as possible. The actual Lorenz system only has a few terms in the dynamics. So that's what we mean. It kind of mathematically maps to our physical intuition of what we want a system to look like. Yeah, really good question. Thank you.
Thank you. Also, what application of machine learning and fluid dynamics are you most excited about?
Boy, that's such a big topic. I mean, I am super excited about these low order models because I believe that these low order models can be used for design, optimization, and control of real engineering systems like aircraft and cars and trucks and engines and things like that. So personally, I'm super excited about the low order modeling of these systems. So things like, this is a movie from my friend JC Loiseau in Paris Tech, where he took a complicated fluid system, this thermosiphon that's hot on the bottom, cold on the top, and he was able to show that this has a low order model on the right that's exactly the same as the Lorenz model. So, what this allows you to do is build a surrogate for this very expensive simulation that he was running that might take, minutes or hours or days on a computer. So if you want to design a new wing or design a new thermosiphon, traditionally you would have to, vary the parameters, run this expensive simulation, see what the output is, and then feed back and change the parameters, run the simulation, see what the output is in this big expensive loop. And that limits how many iterations we can use when we're designing a new aircraft or car or engine. But by building these really efficient surrogate models that run, in milliseconds on very low-end computational hardware, you can massively speed up that design and control cycle. And so you can do things that were previously impossible to do with traditional high-fidelity simulations with these low-order models. So that's one answer. That's what I'm personally excited about. I think the thing that will make the biggest impact in the community are probably closure modeling. I think closure modeling is going to immediately have a tremendous impact in the community. So for example, if you have a fully turbulent flow, again, over a wing or a submarine or a boat or something like that, there is such a large range of scales in space and time, big structures, medium structures, all the way down to tiny structures. And it turns out that in some sense, they all kind of matter for the simulation fidelity. And so finding good closure models that can approximate kind of what's happening in the large energy containing structures without simulating all of the fine scale structures is one of the grand challenge open problems in turbulence. And this is something that is, I think, tailor-made for machine learning solutions, or maybe vice versa. And there's huge strides being made in building better closure models that allow you to simulate these very turbulent systems using much less computational hardware, so much faster. And again, that has all of the same benefits I was talking about with the reduced order models have. It allows you to design, optimize, and control much more complicated systems much faster. So, I mean, I think turbulence closure modeling is really going to dramatically change with machine learning techniques.
Absolutely. Could you also please shortly describe the current limitations of SIMD with respect to applications?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And this question, my answer always changes. Every month, I get asked that question all the time, every single time pretty much. And I think it's a great question. We should always be asking that question. But every month my answer changes because there's an amazing community of researchers out there that are developing new and improved SIMD techniques, making it more powerful, more generalizable. And so a lot of the limitations I would have said 2 years ago are no longer limitations. So I'll just walk through some of the limitations and tell you which ones are still limitations and which ones are not limitations. So the first key limitation is in the number of variables, the dimensionality of my state that I'm representing. So I've shown you, the examples I've shown you had 3 variables, X, Y, and Z. Because if I want to take X, Y, and Z up to 5th order, that's already 81 terms in theta. So the matrix theta of possible terms grows exponentially in the size of my state vector. So if I had 5 variables or 10 variables or 100 variables, this thing gets massively out of control really quickly. Okay, it's approximately 100 to the 5th. So really bad scaling of theta. And that makes the pseudo-inverse ill-conditioned and all kinds of downstream effects that are bad. So that's one key limitation, is just the number of variables we can include in our models. To date, I think the most we've included is 7. 7 is the most variables I've seen in a SIMD model. But okay, there's a couple of innovations that have made this much better. The first one is Kathleen's autoencoder. So we can get enhanced dimensionality reduction, which means fewer variables in Z than if we just did linear embeddings. So that's one tool in our arsenal. The second one is this tensor train SIMD variant that our German collaborators developed. I believe it was Gels et al., where they essentially build a tensorial representation for theta, which means you can go to much more complicated functions and a much higher dimensional Z vector, and it still scales much better. So kind of the tensor version of SIMD is super powerful. And then the third innovation was by Jared Callahan, again from our group at UW, where he essentially has developed a stochastic extension for SIMD. And this is, again, building on the work of Bonasega and Clementi and others, which essentially allows me to take a very complex system like a turbulent system and represent the low order terms as stochastic forcing on the big energy coherent terms. So that really helps the scaling. It allows me to focus on a couple variables I care about, but still account for the hundreds of variables I'm throwing away, because I'm no longer throwing them away. I'm treating them as stochastic forcing. And he's demonstrated this on real experimental data from a turbulent experiment collected by George Regas at Imperial. So again, there are still limitations. Finding the right coordinates is hard. Learning what the right theta functions are is not always easy. The sparse regression sometimes doesn't converge. Those are the 3 key challenges. But time after time, colleagues have found ways of kind of getting around those problems, and they're still innovating them today. So yeah, there are definitely still challenges, but at the same time, I'm pretty hopeful because all of the key challenges we have seen in the past have been just kind of falling by the wayside. Yeah, great question. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. What happens if you have data that is entirely in steady state?
Yeah, so if you don't have time variation, you can't use SIMD. So that's a good question. This is fundamentally for dynamical systems, for things that vary in time. ddt of some variable equals a function of those variables. Now, most of the systems I care about are dynamic in nature. They vary in time. You can technically use the PDE find variant. So let me see if I can go back here. So this partial differential equation discovery tool, you technically don't have to have it be a time derivative on the left. You could have it be a spatial derivative on the left, and you could discover, elliptic PDEs or things like that. And also, Dan Shea, who's a PhD student working with Nathan Kutz and myself, has extended Cindy to boundary value problems. So for example, you have like a beam or a wing, and you put different forces on it and you see how it deflects in steady state. You can take that data and uncover a a model of that system using a Cindy variant. So the original Cindy doesn't work on data in steady state, but there are variants like Cindy BVP that work on data that's not varying in time. Yeah, good question. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question here that is asking if you have any more thoughts on the extrapolation problem.
Yeah, I mean, extrapolation is hard, and you should always be wary of people telling you that they can extrapolate. I would say that I say that you should be wary of people saying you can extrapolate, and I'm about to say that you can extrapolate. So in our experience, models that are constrained to be sparse and interpretable tend to also have better generalizability and extrapolation capabilities. And I'm going to go right back to that F equals ma and E equals mc squared. Physics means kind of the rules that generalize. Okay, and physics, doesn't necessarily have to mean the physics of matter and energy. Economic systems have a physics of sorts. Biological systems have a physics of sorts. And maybe we can't write down a governing equation, or we haven't been able to yet, but we know that there are rules that kind of generalize sometimes. And so uncovering those key rules that generalize, generally in all of the textbooks I've ever learned from, they tend to be sparse. They tend to be simple. Maybe that's because that's what humans could represent with our minds, or maybe that's a more fundamental principle of parsimony in the world, in the universe. We don't know. Generally, our Cindy models, if you build one with training data and you take an initial condition that is nowhere near that training data, so in the Lorenz system, I take an initial condition way off the attractor, it will still pretty faithfully represent the dynamics of that trajectory. If you do that same thing with a neural network and you have not trained off of the attractor, it's going to usually fail pretty miserably, because it's not sparse. It's putting all of this effort into fitting, or maybe even overfitting to the attractor that it's seen. So for me, this is highly biased. I am a biased, I think that sparsity and parsimony is the principle that has time and time again shown the ability to generalize for extrapolation problems, things like F equals ma and Lorenz's equations and E equals mc squared and things like that. But that's just my opinion. Okay, and you can go back through history, right? Like Kepler wrote down his ellipses. Those were a perfectly good description of the motion of the planets. That was accurate to the data. That's kind of like what most machine learning or neural networks do. They fit what you've seen, and they do a great job. But it tells you nothing about how to design a space mission to the moon. You need Newton's law, F equals ma, for that. That's the physics. Kepler was the machine learning fitting. And so we want something more like Newton than Kepler. Yeah, great question. Thank you.
Thank you. Following up on the question about the steady state data, if the data is a snapshot of the fluid flow, how do you capture the dynamics?
If the data, so you generally would need a time series or a movie of that flow field evolving in time, or maybe not the whole flow field, but the variables you care about, the lift and the drag and things like that. You'd need some measurement of your system at a number of instances in time evolving So that's pretty critical for almost everything I've shown you here. Is time series measurements are really important. The first two examples I showed with the robust principal components analysis and the super resolution, technically those don't need to be movies. Those could just be a collection of images in any random order, and that's fine. But for all of the modeling stuff I'm showing you, we really do assume that we have time series measurements with a small enough time step that I can approximate derivatives. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty standard assumption for reduced order modeling.
Yep. I just wanted to squeeze in my own question. So for the work on going from low resolution to high resolution, is the training data, I guess, a couple of like low resolution with high resolution of the same time?
Exactly.
Over
yeah.
there? Okay.
That's exactly right. So we basically take a high resolution training set and we pretend that we have it downsampled like in B, and we feed those pairs into the decoder. So a high resolution snapshot and its counterpart in low resolution, and we train on those pairs.
Okay, perfect. Yep. I have a question. I assume the further along the time horizon, the more model prediction degrades.
Generally speaking, that's a pretty good rule of thumb. Not always the case, but generally the case. Especially for chaotic systems. So, chaotic systems are defined by this sensitive dependence on initial conditions. So even if my model is pretty close to the truth and my initial condition is pretty close, for a chaotic system, eventually they're going to diverge kind of exponentially. Now, if you look at the statistics, if I take an ensemble of initial conditions and I run them all forward in time, oftentimes for chaotic systems, we want to look at what the statistics do in time. And so that might be a better measure of if your model's doing a good job. Kind of like that's what we would do in weather systems, is look at the statistics of an ensemble.
Yep. If that's it, so knowing that, how further along could the model produce meaningful predictions, depending on how much data and how long they span?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think you've actually keyed in on one of the fundamental, I would say that's one of the fundamental questions in forecasting and prediction in general. Is there a fundamental uncertainty principle, like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, that relates the quality and quantity of data I have with the quality and kind of duration of forecasting I can produce from that? To my knowledge, that is a very hard open problem, and it's unlikely that we're ever going to get a universal theorem like that for all systems. But it is likely that for specific systems, we could probably develop uncertainty principles like that. So actually, a postdoc working with Nathan and myself, Henning Lange, has developed a Koopman Fourier transform neural network that kind of transforms data, time series data, into a coordinate system where it looks very sinusoidal and periodic. And he does have some theorems about kind of forecasting limits based on the quality and quantity of the training data for those quasi-periodic systems. Does not apply to chaotic systems. It's very interesting. It's pretty deep, kind of mathematically, but I believe it just was accepted in Journal of Machine Learning Research. So if you're curious, that's at least one area where we have this kind of uncertainty principle relating those two. But it's such a good question. That question could easily occupy 100 careers of great machine learning researchers. That is a fundamental question that we're going to be asking and needing answers for the next 100 years. Yeah.
Thank you. Someone here would love to hear your thoughts on incorporating explicit physics laws more explicitly, maybe in the deep learning loss functions, and their effect on extrapolation.
Okay, great question. So maybe I'll just go to the Cindy autoencoder picture as a little just so we have a picture of a neural network here. So I like to oversimplify this a little bit, and I just say, like, what are the areas where we can bake in physical knowledge? So in any machine learning procedure, there are like 4 key ingredients, and I hope I can remember them all on the spot. So the first key ingredient, what is the training data you're collecting and presenting to the learning machine? Okay, the second question is, what is the structure of the learning machine? Like, what's the actual structure of your hardware or the neural network that you're going to use? Because that structure can encode a lot of physical knowledge. Another one is, what is the loss function that you're going to use to encode how good your model is doing? And the fourth one, I just remembered at the very end, the fourth one is, what is the actual optimization algorithms you're going to use to train that architecture with your data to minimize that loss function? Those are the 4 key ingredients for basically all machine learning. And you can impose or incorporate physical knowledge about your physics of your system in every single one of those steps. And there are dozens of researchers across the world focusing on each of those and combinations of those. So let's go kind of one by one. Let's say that I know that my world has invariances to rotations, right? So ImageNet, human images, we know that if I have a picture of a dog and I rotate it or translate it or scale it, it's still a dog. And so I want my learning machine to know that a dog, the concept of a dog, is invariant to camera transformations. So what I could do is, on all of my input data, I could take my input data, my images, and I could rotate and translate and scale them and augment my data to have that physical invariance built in or cooked into the data set. And that's the most common technique people use, is just augmenting the data, making it larger to incorporate the invariances you know are there. Okay, it's kind of expensive, but it works. Another way of doing this is to manually put in some kind of physical structure into the network that you believe, like, basically you can make your network invariant by construction. So for example, if I put in a convolutional layer, I am allowing my architecture to incorporate certain types of translational invariance in its very structure. Okay, so that's one. And lots of groups are working on, how do I build architectures that have physical invariance, like Galilean invariances and rotational invariances, built in by construction? Good. What we do, okay, so we're taking kind of maybe the third and fourth approach, is that I believe that physics can be incorporated as constraints on in the optimization routine. So I put constraints on Xi. And also as statistical priors that I can put in my loss function. Like, I want Xi to have a small 1 norm. And so we, in our loss function, write down these penalty terms or these regularization terms that incorporate our bias or priors about the physics. And similarly, our optimizations, we can manually constrain those optimizations to find solutions that are physical by construction. That was like a very brief overview of a topic that hundreds of researchers are working hard on. So for example, there are Lagrangian neural networks and Hamiltonian neural networks that have this structure just baked in to the network. So Peter Battaglia, Stefan Hoyer, Miles Cranmer, Naomi Leonard, many excellent researchers are kind of building network architectures that have physics at their very core. And I think that's an extremely exciting area.
Thank you. Speaking of
I can go for a bit longer, yeah?
Yeah.
Maybe until 10:15.
Okay. So speaking of convolutional nets, since there are new attempts at using transformers for image processing instead of CovNets, are there attempts to do that for physical simulations as well?
That's a really, really good question. So that's actually one I am sure that there are. I can't pinpoint a specific case right now that I would want to talk about. I think that idea is absolutely going to catch hold in the kind of machine learning for physics community. It seems like that's just a natural kind of next step to go in. Off the top of my head, I can't think of like an immediate success story to kind of relate that. But yeah, I think it's definitely happening.
For sure. And so I have a question. Sorry if this is too open-ended, but do you see some of the progress done in tackling closure models and fluid dynamics here applicable in other fields of physics as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So turbulence, us in fluid dynamics like to say, this is a quote from Feynman, turbulence is the last kind of unsolved problem in classical physics. But turbulence really has a lot of similarities. It's kind of the prototypical complex system. So, lots and lots of systems we care about have the same features of turbulence. They have many, many scales in space and in time, nonlinearity, things like that. So there is this large field of coarse graining, which is basically taking a system that is very, very multi-scale in space and time and figuring out how to kind of take your glasses off and only look at the big structures and still account for the statistical effect of all of the little structures. So to some extent, if you think about gas dynamics and thermodynamics, that is a huge success story of coarse graining. I can take 10 to the 26 molecules, and I can describe them by a very, very small number of physical parameters, temperature, volume, pressure. I can describe them with very few coarse grain descriptions that are extremely accurate in the aggregate. So, gas dynamics is this massive success story, this kind of Boltzmann description of gases. We don't have that for turbulence. We don't have that for protein folding. We don't have that for neuroscience. We don't have that for how sand piles fracture and spill. We don't have that for multi-scale materials like composite wings. And so all of those systems that are fundamentally multi-scale will benefit from improved closure modeling, because closure modeling in turbulence is really a specific application of coarse graining in general. And that's, I think, probably one of the grand challenge areas of physics that's opening up in the 21st century because of machine learning, is this ability to go from, if we look at the last century, it's defined by clever people making just the right approximation to take a system and make it manageable by humans. In the next century, I believe we're going to open up these extremely complex systems, multi-scale systems, where there are no human approximations that make them simple, but where we can use these kind of data-driven coarse graining techniques to get workable models that are useful for engineering purposes. So yeah, I think it's going to be extremely applicable to lots of systems.
Absolutely. Another comment here is that the closure problem seems very similar to the requirement of renormalizability in quantum field theories, because you want the homogeneity between small and large length or energy scales.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. And in fact, I learned about this stuff from Wayne E. at Princeton in his class on kind of multi-scale modeling. And he polled the class at the beginning, what example system do you want us to talk about for the renormalization group for these multi-scale systems? And he actually chose turbulence that year out of, maybe 4 or 5 canonical classical physical systems. But yeah, this idea of renormalization comes up all over the place as this kind of unifying theme for multi-scale systems. Absolutely.
Absolutely. All right, I think that's all the questions in the chat, and we only have a few minutes left. So I just wanted to thank everybody so much for attending this session, and especially Steve for hosting it. It was very, very, very well done and very informative and interesting. And yeah, if anyone in the comments and chats that haven't done so already. ACE hosts sessions like this a couple of times a week, so please subscribe to the YouTube channel if you're interested in seeing more. Thank you so much.